So welcome, everyone. We're going to wait a couple of minutes before getting started, just to make sure we give everyone time to log in and find the password and all the new things that we need to do with Zoom nowadays. So we'll get started in a few minutes. If I can just remind everyone should mute themselves so that we don't have the background noise during the presentation. And Angela, I should have asked you this ahead of time. Can you pronounce your last name for us?
Sure, Pilla.
Pilla. Okay, I can do that one. Okay, I'll give one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, I have 2:04 on my computer, so I think we'll get started. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to joining our research seminar series. This one will be about export control. So we're fortunate enough to have Angela Pilla from CUNY. She's actually the University Export Control Officer, and she's going to talk to us about export controls. She's labeled the presentation Export Controls 101. We would ask that everyone remember to mute themselves during the presentation. I believe we're going to have small enough groups so that after the presentation, if there are questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask the questions. So Angela, welcome. And
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. My pleasure. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela. I am new to CUNY. I'd like to say I started in September as the University Export Control Officer in the Office of Research in the Research Integrity and Compliance Division. Prior to joining CUNY, I worked at Northwell Health for 16 years. The last 5 years were spent in research compliance. I built and managed the Export Controls Compliance Division and supported the researchers for the Feinstein Institutes of Medical Research, as well as worked in other areas of compliance. So if we can just launch the first poll, it's just a quick question, no pressure. Just want to gauge the audience to see if they've ever heard of export controls before today's session. I can't see the poll, so whenever if you feel that you've gotten enough responses, you can publish it. Okay, that's a fair response. Okay, so about half. So after taking today's session, If anything, I just want you to have a high-level overview of what export control regulations are, why we have them, the current review process, to be able to identify some areas of research that are subject to the federal regulations that maybe you haven't heard of before. Also have a basic understanding of what the export control administrator does at your college, and when to determine when to reach out for help. Okay, so before we begin, just some terminology that you're going to hear throughout the presentation. So for our purposes, for export controls, an export is any type of oral, written, electronic, or visual information or item that's physically sent out of the United States, whether it's transferred, transmitted, whatever word you'd like to use, being sent outside of the United States. When that release happens is when the export has happened. So that can mean that you're hand carrying with you items or information, materials, or you shipped it out through FedEx. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's already exported once the information or item has been released. The non-physical version of an export is a deemed export. And I think this is the toughest part of export compliance, because it's when you release or transfer information to a foreign national or a foreign person within the United States. So someone in our labs, they're looking at unpublished research, or they get an email with export controlled technology, whatever the case may be, that is when the deemed export has occurred. A foreign national or a foreign person is any person that is not a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident, green card holder, or someone that has a protected individual status. That can also mean foreign governments, foreign institutions, research organizations that are not set up to do business in the United States. Technology and technical data are similar terms. They come from two different sets of regulations. Technology is the information that is necessary for developing or producing or even using a product, whereas technical data is the information that is required to design or develop defense articles. So they're somewhat similar, and for our purposes, we'll go over it a little bit later, the different regulations and how they apply. What are export controls and what are their purpose? So export control regulations have been around since the 1940s, and since 9/11, they decided to scrutinize more what we're sending outside of this country and even what we're sending inside of the country to foreign nationals. So there are federal laws and regulations that include sanctions and embargoes that restrict the transfer and the export or release of information and certain goods and technology to foreign nationals, whether they're here in the United States or out of the United States. The reason and their purpose is to support national security and foreign policy interests. By restricting the access to the information and the items, you prevent, at least I hope so, terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And we'll get into that a little bit later. It also helps us keep our competitiveness economically and academically. There are three main government agencies that are involved in administering export control regulations. Other government agencies intersect with these, but for export control purposes, these are the three main ones that you need to know. The Department of Commerce, Department of State, and Department of Treasury. Department of Commerce, through the Bureau of Industry and Security, administers what's called the Export Administration Regulations, or the EAR. And they regulate certain commercial goods and services that have the potential to be a military item. So those items that have the military application are known as dual use items. It's a little different than dual use research of concern. So these items, it could be a research type of equipment. It could be a mass spectrometer, night vision goggles, lasers, things of that nature. It could also apply to clinical items. There can be, my favorite example is the triggered spark gap. It's used to break up kidney stones, but it also could detonate weapons. So just keep that in mind when you're engaging with foreign universities and collaborations, that certain items that we use here could be used for military purposes. These items that are called dual use items are found on what's called the Commerce Control List on the CCL. And these items are categorized 0 through 9, and they're a broad range of items and software technology. And if they are found on the Commerce Control List, they're known as the Export Control Classification Number, the ECCN. And those items are considered to be export controlled or subject to the regulations. So most times those items would require prior authorization before you're sending them out or giving access to a foreign national. If the item is not found on those lists, then you can classify your item as EAR 99, which is basically a catch-all phrase for items that are not subject to the regulations. However, because export controls are complex and constantly changing, if you have an item that is EAR 99 that is not subject to the regs, but you're sending the item to a sanctioned country like Cuba or North Korea, then license requirements may be involved. Then you have the Department of State through Directorate Defense Trade Control, the DDTC. They regulate the defense articles and services that have technical data related that are military in nature, and they do this through administrating the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, the ITAR. And by doing this, they safeguard national security, and they also have their own list known as the United States Munitions List, the USML. They have 22 categories as well, and it's safe to say that those items would require a license prior to or prior authorization before sending them out, regardless of where it's going to. There's certain countries that are prohibited from receiving ITAR or export control related technology or goods. The Department of Treasury, through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, they enforce embargoes and trade restrictions against foreign entities and countries and governments, and through that harm or threaten our national security. And that's through the Foreign Asset Control Regulations. They also have their own list, especially a designated nationals list that also has people that are like Vladimir Putin or Russian oligarchs, all the way from drug traffickers to people who violate humanitarian rights and things of that nature. It's a broad list of individuals and entities, and all of these lists constantly change. They remove people, they add people. So as you can see, export controls is a very complicated space. This list is definitely not exhaustive, but these are some activities that might require additional review from my office. So if you're thinking about engaging in research that involves any type of controlled, not just export control, but controlled material, technical data, biological agents, anything that you're planning on sending outside of the US, it's a good idea to check in with us as well as environmental health and safety to make sure that these items don't need prior authorization. And on the other end, they might have some import implications as well. If you're thinking about engaging into international collaborations with any country, but specifically sanctioned countries, currently the comprehensively sanctioned countries are Cuba, certain areas in the Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, and Syria, a license would be required or prior authorization. And most times it takes a very long time to obtain a license. I recently just went through this process. It took us 2 years to obtain a license for a professor to engage with former students in Iran. I'm not sure if that's because of the pandemic, but it does take a long time to get authorization to engage in an activity that would be normally prohibited. If you're planning on teaching, researching, or collaborating with foreign nationals that are from these sanctioned countries, it's the same as if when you're releasing the information or you're exporting, like the deemed export, you're releasing that information, it's as if you're releasing that item or information to the home country of the individual. So the same rules apply. So if you're thinking about engaging with them, please check in with our office prior to engaging with them. If you're planning on hiring or hosting any foreign nationals on campus, whether they're F1 students, J1s, it doesn't matter the work authorization or visa type, they definitely need to be vetted and screened. We need to know where they're coming from. Are they affiliated with a university that's known as a military end user? All of these things are important prior to them even stepping foot onto campus. When you're training foreign nationals that have access to export controlled data or technology, or giving them a tour through the research lab, it's important to know what's restricted and what's not. Perhaps give them a separate badge, or they have different kind of access. When you're teaching them about export controlled technology, this can be considered a defense service. So it's important. We do want collaborations, we do want diversity, but we have to be careful on how we go about it. If you're planning on traveling or working in sanctioned countries, this can be done with certain sanctioned countries. Of course, we'd have to apply for authorization to do so, but you want to make sure that if you're traveling to Cuba and you want to go to a conference or you want to do your research there, that where you're staying at the hotel is not on the prohibited accommodation list, because a lot of those hotels are owned by the foreign government. So there's a lot of different elements when it comes to export controls in sanctioned countries specifically. If you're planning on engaging in sponsored research, sometimes if you're engaging with DoD funding, there may be some type of contractual clauses in that contract that restricts the information from being published because they want to keep it confidential. They might be using it for one of their military agencies. They might have restrictions on what kind of citizenship is allowed to partake into this kind of research. All of these things are important when prior to engaging with these entities. Also, if you plan on shipping anything out outside of the United States, regardless of what the item is, it could be something that's a chemical or even export controlled technology. If you're engaging in a conversation with somebody outside of the United States or a foreign national within the United States, and you have a non-disclosure agreement, we can work with the Technology Commercialization Office to make sure that this is done properly. So lucky for everyone at City College, we do have an export control administrator, and it's Trisha. And basically, she would serve as a liaison between the Office of Research and City College. And what her role is to provide the researcher, faculty, whoever's engaging in the international activity with initial advice on how to go about staying compliant with the regulations in case there are any requirements that we have to adhere to. And she would come to our office and let us know what's going on. And I would look further into it to make sure that we're complying with the regulations and if there's any prior authorization that's needed beforehand. So she would be the main contact person for this. Also, I mentioned earlier, export control technology or research, if one is needed for that type of research, ITAR related, whatever it is, we would implement a technology control plan. And basically, we will go over it after, but it is a document that is important for engaging in these kinds of activities. She would also coordinate these export control activities with the various departments because export controls, it touches upon different areas for different reasons. So it's important to have an open line of communication when engaging with export control activities. She'd also help out with export control training if needed, and that's why I'm here today. This is the form that Trisha would use if somebody would go to her and say that they wanted to engage into international research activities or academic activities. And if any of the answers are yes, she would come to me, send it to me, and then we would work together to figure out what's the best way forward. If we need a technology control plan, maybe a license or a prior authorization isn't needed, but it's always a good idea just to know who we're engaging with, regardless of the international activity. So I'd mentioned prior authorization or a license. An export license is giving us the authorization to engage in what would be a prohibited activity prior to engaging into the activity. So always keep in mind when you're planning to engage with foreign nationals or collaborating with researchers overseas or having foreign nationals come here to collaborate with, what are you sending out? What is being sent out, regardless of the mode of transportation? Who is receiving the item? What are you sending to this end user? Who is the end user? Is it somebody that might be a prohibited party? And we'll get into that after. Where is the item going? If they're giving you the address of the university, to send it to, or maybe they're giving you a different address. It's not matching the university. That's a red flag for me. Why are the addresses different? There's a lot of investigative work, I'd like to say, that goes behind export controls and what we're doing before we can even do the activity. What is the item going to be used for? What is the purpose of it? What's the end use of this activity? And also, is it a temporary export? Are they going to take the information? What are they going to do with it? Are they going to destroy any items that they have after? Are they going to ship it back to us? Because then there might be some import implications. These are all important questions to ask yourself before you get involved into these activities. So these are just some research areas that are affected by export control regulations that you may or may not have known before. Definitely engineering, any type of space sciences. There's some, for example, items that were controlled by Department of State for military purposes that are no longer, and they are now controlled by Department of Commerce. It's called the 600 series. So these are items that I guess they deemed that were not as regulated as they were before, and that they can be put on a separate list. The ITAR will always trump the EAR. There's research with lasers. I mentioned earlier, mass spectrometers and night vision goggles, things of that nature. A lot of microwave technology, nanotechnology, photonics, cryptographic technology. There's so many different areas that export control touches. Again, research involving controlled chemicals, select agents, things of that nature. So good news for higher education, most of the research that we do falls under fundamental research. And what that really means is it's any basic or applied research in science and engineering, that the results are usually published and shared broadly with the research community. So if you're not planning to publish, or there's restrictions on the publication, then the fundamental research would not really fall, the research would not fall under the fundamental research category. Also, fundamental research does not only apply to sponsored research, it applies to all research. So please keep that in mind. We have what's called the fundamental research exclusion, the FRE. So when it applies to our research is when the research is conducted within the United States. There's no restrictions on the research. There's the only type of restriction or courtesy you can say is the pre-publication review that maybe the sponsor might have, just to make sure that we're protecting any proprietary information. Anything outside of the normal window, whether it be 60 or 120 days, is normal. If you see that they're lengthening the time of how long they're taking to review it, that could also be a red flag. If there's any kind of restriction with nationality of the personnel that's involved in the research or the dissemination of the research, then the fundamental research would no longer apply. This also only applies to the results of the research, not the actual physical items or the software of the research. So if the research happens to be conducted outside of the United States, it would nullify the FRE. Also does not apply to the use of equipment controlled by the ITAR. Then we probably would need a technology control plan because it's no longer fundamental research. This is also including specific software, technical data, things of that nature. And of course, if the research is not intended for publication or there are restrictions in whether it's sponsored or not, it would fall out of the FRE category. So on the back end, we do our due diligence and we do what's called restricted party screening. So it's needed when you are getting involved in contracts or engaging with new vendors. We have to make sure that we're not engaging with bad actors. If we are involved in activities with prohibited parties, then we're already prohibited from engaging with them. So we do this screening to make sure that we know who we're getting involved with. Of course, things happen and people may be added later on to a prohibited party list, which I'll go over in the next slide, and we would get alerted, but we want to know up front who we're getting involved with. Also, when you're exchanging information as part of a non-disclosure agreement or material transfer agreement, you want to make sure that the people that we're engaging with are not from universities that are military research based or anything of that nature. Collaborating with foreign nationals, like I've mentioned, in the US or outside of the US. It's so important to screen them. If you're traveling internationally with CUNY devices, it's best to take with you clean, wiped laptops or whatever kind of devices you're taking with you to make sure that if you happen to be working on export controlled research and you're taking it with you to another country, they have different encryption laws. Even if you keep your laptop in what's called effective control with you at all times, if you put that laptop in a hotel safe, that's it. They can steal all that information and they can take it and they can use it and they can make weapons out of it. So it's really important that when you're traveling, before you even make the accommodations to come to us to review and to perform this restricted party screening. If someone happens to be added after the fact to a prohibited party list, because obviously those lists change, we would get alerted automatically. It's called the dynamic screening alert and it happens in real time. So it's important to screen ahead of time. Same thing with hiring and hosting foreign nationals, regardless of the visa type. If they're coming for a tour, please send me the names. I will screen against them. And then it's so easy to screen. That's the easiest part of all of this, to make sure that we're not engaging with these bad actors. And also when you're signing into any kind of contracts or agreements and there's foreign support or foreign sponsors involved, it's also important that we know that soon we will have, hopefully, more solid information on the National Security Presidential Memorandum, or NSPM 33, that's going to change and standardize mostly conflict of interest disclosures, and you'll have to disclose foreign support and foreign sponsors. So it's important to know if you have an academic appointment elsewhere in another country, if you're getting support from another country, we need to know these things up front. The software that I use is Descartes Visual Compliance, and these are just the categories of the different government lists that people or entities may fall under. So it could be something so simple that they violated, but it could also be somebody on an FBI wanted list. So we want to know if they've ever engaged in any export control violations or if they've fallen into any one of these lists. A lot of the times the results can be false positives, but it's better to check to make sure than to engage with a bad actor. I mentioned the technology control plan if you're working on any kind of export controlled research. A technology control plan is basically a document that safeguards and outlines what we're planning to do with this research. What are the physical controls? Are the labs lock and key? Do you have badge access? However that's set up. Access controls, IT controls, what kind of data sharing or transferring, what kind of security do we have, deemed export license requirements in case you have any foreign nationals that are working on this restricted research, the protocols for sharing the information with the people that are authorized to receive this information that are outside of the laboratory, personnel authorization, the people that are going to be a part of this technology control plan and the project itself. They can take training. They're depending on the type of research. We also have city training. If you go under city training and you go to look under your profile, you'll be able to add the export compliance modules. And there's a bunch of them. They're really helpful. They have quizzes at the end of them, and it would give you a better understanding of export controls. I highly recommend the intro to export controls, but if you are a part of a technology control plan, there might be other modules that you'll have to complete before engaging into this research. Any type of export controlled material should be labeled as such, and also the time frame on the actual TCP. Personnel changes, any type of amendment to the TCP needs to be documented. Of course, the PI is ultimately responsible for the people that are on the TCP. However, it would need other signatures involved depending on what the project is, and we would do monitoring and checking in with you to make sure if anything has changed, you let us know. So, violating the export control violations, the penalties are significant. So they can be against the individual who was violating the regulations. It could be against the institution, or it could be both. And they're administrative, there's civil, there's criminal penalties for all of them. Things obviously happen, so we want to do our best to prevent any unauthorized export releases. So if anything does happen, please, the best way is to self-disclose voluntarily. Usually when this is done, it's used as a mitigating factor, and we can help to reduce the penalties, if any, that are either towards the individual at CUNY, the institution, or both. I'm happy to say that we do have an export control website. Currently, I'm working on updating it, making it more comprehensive, more user-friendly. I think it tends to be a little bit confusing on where things are, but for the most part, we do have a lot of information on our website. Please visit it if you have any questions. There are procedures and policies on there and guidance documents that I think could be helpful. And hopefully in the future, we can create a more streamlined process and guidance that would be helpful for everybody. Okay, so these 3 cases that I think are helpful to understand in the export control world because they are related to higher education. Princeton, a couple of years ago, was fined for violating export control regulations because they had shipped out controlled pathogens to several countries. Not every country needs an export license or prior authorization. However, you have to do your due diligence. You have to know whether or not the country would need a license based on the item that's being sent, who it's being sent to, who's receiving it, if the item itself is restricted for certain reasons of control, national security, anti-terrorism, chemical and biological warfare, depending on the country and the entity. We would have to figure that out before we ship these items. So because they self-disclosed, the penalties were reduced. They still had to pay a significant fine, and then they get audited and they had to enhance their export control program. UMass Lowell, they had sent out an item that was EAR 99 at the time, or not controlled or subject to the regulations. However, the item that they sent out, the atmospheric testing device, was sent to a company that was on the entity list. And the entity list is a list maintained by Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, that is a list of entities that have violated regulations, but also they have licensing requirements where normally maybe that country or that entity wouldn't in the past. And that's also constantly being updated. So Pakistan itself wasn't on the entity list, but the company Suparco was. So it's important. EAR 99 is not a free pass to just send things out just because it's not subject to the regulations. And lastly, but certainly not least, NYU was in the news for 3 researchers that were colluding with China. They were sending the information or the research they were working on MRI technology. They were working on an NIH grant. They colluded with China. They sent the information to China. The people or the government in China gave them stipends, paid for the rent, all these great incentives, and then they were caught. So it's really, really important, if you take away nothing today, that the export control regulations are really complex. They're really high with the penalties, and you can damage your reputation, the institution's reputation. You can also have your exporting privileges taken away because exporting is a privilege, it's not a right. And you can lose federal funding. So it's really important to know who you're engaging with before you engage in any international research activities. I have one more poll question, if you can put it up, Yvette. After today's session, do you think that your research practices are subject to the export control regulations? And that when you feel like you've got enough responses, you can post it. Okay. Well, for those of you that said yes, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm here to help. I hope that this presentation has been helpful and that you have a high level understanding of export control regulations. And I will share the next slide with my contact information as well as Trisha's contact information. If you are engaging in any activities and you might think that the regulations might apply, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. We will entertain some questions, please, in the chat. I know a couple of you really have some pressing questions to ask.
So I'll start off if that's okay. Let me turn on my camera. So first of all, the question was, can the slides be shared? Are
Sure.
you comfortable with us posting the slides
course.
at the recording? Okay, so we will post it. I put the link in the website, but it's on CCNY's research webpage. And if you go to research seminars, you'll see all of the slides as well as the recordings for the research seminar series. So another question, you spoke about foreign nationals. So are all foreign nationals screened or only foreign nationals that may be visiting from certain countries?
They should be screened if they're going to be coming to our campus and if we're going to engage with them, even if it's outside of the United States, if we have a collaboration, any type of engagement, they should be getting screened. So you can come to my office for that. If it's somebody that's a foreign national that's being hired through a visa, they go through the International Student Scholars Office. Ruth Kimona is the director. I work with her a lot. So if they have also the same software I do, but when they have a question or if there's something that comes up, they come to me. But you're welcome to come to me if you have any concerns for any other types of visas or anyone else. If you have visitors that you want to come on campus that you want to give a tour to, you can come to me and I can take a look at it and screen the individuals beforehand.
Great. So some of these questions that I had previous to your presentation, you've addressed most of them, but I'm going to ask them anyway to reinforce them. So how do I know if I'm taking an international trip and I'm taking my laptop with me? How do I know if I should have my laptop screened when I come back, if I'm allowed to take my laptop? How do I know?
It's a good question. So depending on what you're taking with you, if you're just taking your presentation with you and it doesn't involve any export controlled technology or anything that can be subject to the regulations, then it should be okay to take with you. But it's always best practice to take something that's either clean or wiped if you're able to. I don't know if City College has any wiped laptops, but I would only take what's necessary with me. I wouldn't take if export controlled or if you're doing research that's ITAR related, I wouldn't take that with you because of the different encryption laws in the different countries. If you're just taking a presentation with you on the laptop, that's fine. But if you have to take export control technology, then we'd have to look at it a little further to see if you're able to do so. Because we do have exceptions for taking your laptop with you for CUNY, not a personal laptop, but if you're taking your CUNY owned device, there are some exceptions that you're allowed to take with you overseas, as long as you're not taking them to one of the sanctioned countries. So depending on what it is and where you're going, maybe it might fall under an exception that you can take it with you.
So Tricia, there's a question in the chat.
I am not seeing.
Okay.
This is Alan. This is Alan. May I ask a question about the laptops?
Yes.
So let's just say that we take a clean laptop, but during the trip, we probably would like to access our emails. And in our email communication, sometimes we may have attachments that that we would communicate with our collaborators on campus or whatever that may attach some documents or design files and so forth. So when we are during the trip, when we are accessing those emails, would that become a concern of security concerns?
That's a great question. You do have to be careful if you're traveling overseas and you're accessing their VPN. So I would proceed with caution if you plan on opening emails and things of that nature that have attachments, or if you know that there's export controlled information in those emails or technical data. I would be very careful if you plan on opening, because if you happen to have that in the email, then when you open it, the export has been done. So I would just be careful what you're opening and try not to use their VPN. If you can use CUNY's VPN instead.
But if we use our own VPN to access the folders and so forth back in City College campus, would that be considered as a violation or security concern?
I don't think so, depending on what you're accessing. I mean, like I said, if it's export controlled technology, I'd be a bit more concerned. If it's just a regular email that might not have any type of export control information in it, I think it should be okay.
I actually got an email today. I'm sorry, Alan, are you finished?
One more question.
Sure, sorry.
We
My bad.
also have the Dropbox, and in our case, at the Office of Research, we have the Nextcloud, which is considered on-premises cloud service, so it is more secure and so forth. But when we are accessing the information on those Nextcloud or cloud-based data, that also would be considered as a security concern then when we are abroad.
Yes, I would be very careful what you access in the Dropbox or what you send through the Dropbox as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I had an email come in right as this presentation was about to start. And I just really would like to, I got permission to ask on their behalf. The investigator indicated that they're traveling to France for a scheduled experiment in May and would need to FedEx some samples to the facility in France and will bring their laptop. They wanted to know if they would need to file an application or not, and to note that the research is not defense related, nor does it have anything to do with national security. I'm pleased to say that the individual joined us today on the presentation because I sent it to them right away that you were presenting. And to follow up with that, they also asked about the content is on the cloud and it's not connected to the laptop. That is hard to clean. Can you respond to their travels abroad in bringing and sending any material ahead of their trip?
Sure. So I would just want to take a look at what they're sending, and even if there's no national security controls or anything like that, just to make sure there's no implications. It should be fine if it's going to France, if there's no prohibited parties involved. Usually France is not one of the high-risk countries, but I would want to take a look at it anyway before. And as far as the laptop, I would just make sure that there's no technical information on there, anything related to anything export control related. But if it's just the items that are being sent ahead of time, that's okay. I would want to know who the entity is that's receiving the information or the items and their name and their affiliation so that I can screen it to make sure that we're good to go.
So just to follow up with that, would this be, would this case be looking for like a dual use item, seeing that they are exporting something outside of the
Right.
US, you would want to see whether this would classify as a dual use item?
Correct. So that's the purpose of it, right? We're making
Excellent.
sure that if the item happens to be dual use, most of the time it's not, but if it is, we want to make sure that we get a license before to export it. Because when we're exporting, we need to know who we're sending it to. We might have to sign an end user document as well. The same goes for if they were importing it to us, right? We want to know who's sending things to us. They're then the exporter. So I would want to make sure that it's not a dual use item, not a defense item. It might not be, but that's why we do the screening as well, to see who we're engaging with and what we're sending is not controlled. And if it is controlled, then we get the authorization beforehand before sending it out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So there is a question that I thought was in the chat, but it is to me. So if an item is not on the control list and thus falls into the EAR 99, one can complete the transfer to a friendly country under the category without a license, correct?
So you can classify it if you can find it on the list and you feel that it is EAR 99. You can obviously run it by me so we can classify it together. If we need to, we can go to the government agency to classify if we don't feel that our conclusion is correct. But yes, you should be able to send an EAR 99 item, which means not subject to the regulations, to a country that is not a country of concern. If it is a sanctioned country or a high-risk country, then there might be licensing requirements tied to that EAR 99 item. That's a good question.
But then what happens in the future if it is put on the list?
Well, then if it happens in the future, then there's going to be licensing requirements tied to it. But in the present time, if it's EAR 99, export controls isn't retroactive. So it's not
Okay.
going to, you're not going to get in trouble because you sent something that at the time was not controlled and now is.
So I don't have to do anything retroactively.
No, it wouldn't apply.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? So if not, thank you again, Angela, for your time. And I'm sure we will reach out to you if we have additional concerns or export control questions. Trisha's here to help, but also we will pass things by you as well. I
Thank
do
you.
want to make a plug that our next research seminar series is on May 11th. That's also a Thursday. And the topic is managing research effort and managing release time effort certification. So that'll be given by Candace Baptiste Sexton, who's our grants and sponsored programs director. That's on May 11th, and all the seminars are from 2 to 3. If you tuned in late, or if you want to re-watch this seminar, it will be posted on the Office of Research website. Give us a couple of days to get the slides and the recording posted. But if you go to the Office of Research on the website, you'll be able to look under research seminars, and you'll be able to find all past seminars as well as this seminar. So again, thank you, Angela, and thank you everyone for coming. Have a good
Thank you.
having me.
Thanks, Angela. Bye.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.